Anthony Campolo come and join us to talk about some cool things. I'm not going to spoil anything. It looks that Anthony has been super busy and working with Jamstack projects and being a developer advocate for StepsIn and for Redwood. And I'm super excited to hear what you have to share with us tonight, Anthony. So if you want, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anthony Campolo. I am a developer advocate at StepsIn, and I'm also on the core team for redwoodjs. And today I'm going to be talking about the Jamstack going full stack, or Fullstack Jamstack. And to kind of set some context of why I'm talking about this, I've been doing a podcast that I started about a year ago called FS Jam. And the idea with this is to explore this emerging space of different projects that are happening in the ecosystem. And so there's going to be a wide range of things we're going to be talking about here, from completely open source tools to completely proprietary tools, and a wide range of things along that spectrum. And I have some sort of conflict of interest with like almost half of these, so just disclaimer there. But I made a bet kind of on this ecosystem back when I didn't have a job. I wasn't even on the Redwood team. I was just a bootcamp student learning how to do web dev and what that meant. And I just found that it was a really interesting space and there's really interesting things happening. And it didn't seem like there was much coverage or that anyone had kind of bundled them all together into like a single kind of movement. And this is why we kind of started talking about this as Fullstack Jamstack. And we'll talk about how that kind of differs from the Jamstack, since this is a Jamstack meetup. You guys probably already have some sort of idea of what exactly the Jamstack is. It's usually delivering static files to a CDN, and you do it with git push. If you think of that kind of paradigm, what happens when you add a database to the mix or a server to the mix? That's a bit of what you get with Fullstack Jamstack. But if you really want to kind of wrap your mind around it, I think the best way to do this is to look at something like redwoodjs, because as far as I can tell, the first person who was really using the term Fullstack Jamstack was Tom Preston-Warner. And he's someone who's been involved with Netlify since the very beginning, and Netlify themselves and the Jamstack is really based on this whole paradigm of static site generators, which was very, very heavily popularized by tools like Jekyll, which was also created by Tom Preston-Warner. And the idea was exactly what I was saying before. We want to have the same Jamstack paradigms and what we all love about the Jamstack for a full stack. So for something like Ruby on Rails or a Laravel, and that we also wanted to do that in JavaScript. And Redwood used React, GraphQL, and Prisma. We'll talk about Prisma a little more later, but it's been building now for really close to 3 years, even though it doesn't kind of seem like that long from the outside, because it was worked on for a while, kind of just among Tom and Peter together for about a year. And then they worked on it publicly, but not really with anyone paying attention for like another year. And then it launched in like 2020 of March. And since then, we've seen a lot of changes in the ecosystem. And what was really interesting and what first kind of inspired myself and my co-host Chris to start the podcast is when we saw this come out. This is Bison, which is from the team over EchoBind, and their CTO Chris Ball is the lead maintainer on this, and it says Fullstack Jamstack in the box. So this is the first time that we saw someone else creating their own thing and putting the label Fullstack Jamstack on it. And so it then begs the question, all right, well, what does that mean? What is Fullstack Jamstack, and what influences does it take from Redwood? What does it kind of do by itself? There's, I would say, a little bit of a blurry line here with whether Bison is a full-fledged framework or a really well built out boilerplate. That line could be a little bit blurry sometimes, but it's more so giving you a fully configured project with auth, with deployment, and all of those things. And Redwood gives you the ability to build that out, but doesn't have as many opinions in terms of just giving you a straight boilerplate that already has it all together for you. So that's the main difference between these two things. There's also a lot more people working on Redwood and using Redwood. Bison is very cool though, and I think other people should check it out for sure. Something else to talk about, just for the sake of everyone comparing this to Redwood, Blitz is frequently bundled together with Redwood as this other full stack React framework that uses Prisma. And this is true, but it doesn't really fit into the FSJam paradigm in the same way because one is going for a monolithic development workflow in the sense of your front end and your back end does not have any API between it at all. And you don't bring in as many third-party services, APIs, and things like that. So it's less Jamstacky and it's less decoupled, but it is a React framework with Prisma, with a database and all that kind of together. So you'll frequently hear this brought into the conversation as well. But I know Brandon, he's been on the podcast 3 times and he does not call Blitz Fullstack Jamstack and likely never will. So this is a newer, really interesting project called Wasp. And people are already comparing it to Redwood, but there's some very subtle, interesting differences here because with Wasp, it's also using Prisma and React and Node. So it's a similar stack, but what it also gives you is it gives you something called the Wasp. There's a Wasp language. That's kind of like a configuration language. And this is where you get into things like infrastructure as code and GitOps and things like that. And I'm really excited for this because this is actually something that I've been talking about with these frameworks going on almost a year now, which is that it's really hard to actually deploy these things and do it consistently and reproducibly without some sort of infrastructure as code type layer. So this is definitely one to watch out for. And I think we're going to see more kind of heavy integrations with infra as code with some of these frameworks. And then Prisma is the one thing that all 4 of these projects were using. So this is where we kind of get into the crux of what does actually mean for something to be full stack Jamstack and why I'm not including things like, say, CMSs in this conversation. Now, it's not to say that you can't use a headless CMS with an FSJam project, but the idea is that you are not completely outsourcing the backend to a service. You are still building your own backend in some respect. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean you're hosting your own backend, which we'll get into after this, but you have some sort of model, you have a data model, you own the data, you have a database. And so that is the real key difference I kind of see here. And this is why Prisma is so important to this conversation, because Prisma is an ORM that's very much like an active record or Laravel, these types of things that do translation from your language to SQL and also does migrations to make sure your schema is always in the right place. And it's a very, very nice developer experience. And it's been building for many, many years now and has just recently started adding MongoDB support, which can make it possible to switch from SQL to NoSQL backends, which is like really fascinating and shows how far this ecosystem has come. Because when this was first starting and we first started talking about this, I remember actually writing a blog post about this of like, what's the status on Mongo and Prisma. And it was just like, such a huge, complicated project. It was so many months away. And then they just kept chipping away. And finally we're getting here. But we also actually have to store our data somewhere. And this is where we get into these kind of, what I like to say is they're a little bit like trying to create a backend Netlify, because Netlify gives you a really nice UI, really nice dashboard, really nice workflow for deploying your front end assets in the simplest possible way. And we want that for our databases as well. And Fauna is long time in this space. And if you look at early projects from a couple of years ago with things like Gatsby and Netlify functions and a Fauna backend, you started to see a lot of these patterns start to emerge of how you could have your front end and your back end both on these globally distributed, almost kind of CDN-like things, and you stitch them together through environment variables. And this is where we start to see this becoming more of an actual thing, because we're seeing many, many, many more ways to actually host that backend. One that I guess a lot of people here are already familiar with is Soupbase. Soupbase is meant to be an open source alternative to Firebase. And this gets at the same thing of, we want to actually control our backend, even though we don't want to have to go through all of the pain of like configuring it and hosting it and serving it. We still want to actually have control of the data. And so building on something like Postgres instead of proprietary Firebase database allows your data to be much more portable. And so most of the things we'll be looking at here will be doing Postgres, but not entirely. And then we also see that this gives us things like authentication as well. And that's a really key piece here, is that we are building our own backends. And if you're building your own backend, that also means you're responsible for securing that backend and for making sure that it has the right authentication, the right permissions, and all that. And that's where you bring in things like GoTrue, which is Netlify's authentication service. And you have, or it's a library, not a service. And then you have things like all these plugins for GitHub and Twitter, and like there's a lot of auth that's being built out with Soupbase. And it's been cool because like when they were first starting out, some of the Redwood developers started building stuff with it. They're like, this is really cool. And now like Soupbase is blowing up and everyone's talking about them. So really happy to see them getting some well-deserved attention. Myself though, personally, I host almost all of my stuff on Railway. I'm a really, really big fan of Railway because it's a lot more of a bare bones experience than Soupbase, in that it gives you the ability to spin something up really fast and access it and get some metrics on it. And it's just like, do what you will with it. It's also really cool because it doesn't just give you Postgres. You can also use it with MongoDB or Redis or even MySQL. And MySQL is something that I've always had the hardest time figuring out, like, how do you host that if you're not just like doing, AWS? Because there's like Heroku ClearDB is the closest thing that I could find, but this is one of the only ways you can actually get a MySQL database, which can be really useful if that's the kind of thing you want. Both of these, though, don't really have an opinion on how you're going to access that database versus these other options where they're giving you a GraphQL API already on top of that database. And Asura also using Postgres, and they've built out their own GraphQL engine for accessing it. And Asura has been around for a long time, and they've been kind of the back end of choice for lots of developers that were doing this before there was ever any such thing as FS Jam. So they're huge pioneers in the space and have done a lot of really great work, especially focusing on open source and building up their open source tooling, which is really cool. And that's enabled then other companies such as Nhost to build a level on top, where this is like Soupbase. It's the open source Firebase alternative, but with GraphQL. And the way they do that is by bundling Asura with it. And so you already have the database set up. You already have the GraphQL API set up as well. Now, the one thing, though, that we haven't really talked about in this talk is containers. And the reason why is because containers are not that much of a thing yet in the FS Jam world, but this is like going to change very, very soon. It's kind of in the process of changing now, because projects like Redwood have been built to be serverless by default, in the sense that you are building an API that is being hosted on a Lambda handler via something like Netlify functions, although you can deploy straight to Lambda if you want. And that can be really great for DX and getting it up and testing it really fast. But there's a lot of problems that come along with this, mostly because you don't actually want to shove your entire application into one single Lambda handler. This is like a thing that serverless people are constantly talking about. It's the Lambda lith, or the monolithic Lambda. It leads to a lot of problems because the larger your functions are, the slower they will start up. And so cold start problem is already a well-known problem in the serverless world, but it's exacerbated by these frameworks that have these architectures that are already leading you down the path of having a Lambda lith. So you then ask the question, okay, well, what if we just host these things on an actual server like we used to? And there's now going to be ways to do that very simply, along with the kind of serverless functions. And Fly, I think, is a good example of one of these platforms that lets you host Docker containers. You can host Postgres on Docker containers. You can host all sorts of stuff here. And I'm not seeing a lot of other kind of container-like services, but you're also seeing a lot of innovation here, even in just AWS with things like their app runner. So people are in situations where they just have to have some sort of persistent server for all sorts of reasons, and having a really nice container deployment service can be a huge help there. Now we're getting into how do we actually stitch all this stuff together, and especially how do we bring in other third-party APIs as well. So if you do want to then include a CMS, like a Graph CMS or a Storyblock or something like that, you would need to figure out how to hook that into your application. You could do that through things like node fetch or the GraphQL requests and make GraphQL queries from your project. But that can get really messy and very unmanageable as you have more and more endpoints that you're querying. You're bringing data from more and more places. And that's what makes API meshes and these types of things. And we're going to hear a lot more about this for Jaden's talk. StepsIn and TakeShape get compared fairly frequently. Usually when I tell people that I work for StepsIn, they'll ask me kind of how it compares to TakeShape. And I think me and Jaden are also in a competition to see who can speak at the most Jamstack meetups of all time. We've been at quite a few of them. I think this is probably like my 6th or 7th that I've done. And it's the thing you want to think about is what do you actually need to stitch together, and then what capabilities does your mesh have? So for StepsIn, we give you the ability to hook directly into REST APIs, and you can translate that into a GraphQL schema. And then you also can consolidate all of those schemas into one single endpoint. So you get something kind of similar to like a one graph idea. And then you are able to have a front end that is just querying your one giant graph. And this goes really well with something like Redwood, because Redwood already gives you one giant GraphQL graph at the end of the day. So it's a cool model to kind of centralize on, because it lets everyone lean into the things that make GraphQL so great, which is standardization of the language and standardization of how you send queries and mutations and how you deal with variables and that sort of stuff. So this is what I spend the majority of my day-to-day work on. I'm a developer advocate at StepsIn, and I won't talk too much about TakeShape because Jaden will be giving you a whole kind of explanation of this. I believe that probably the biggest difference right now is that I don't think they do databases yet. They said it's on the roadmap, whereas we do a lot of databases. And the flip side is that we're still kind of getting into really the connecting the different GraphQL APIs together with like GraphQL directives. So you're going to want to kind of look, when you need a mesh, you're going to want to look at what is supported in the mesh already, what's on the roadmap, how does that map with your specific kind of project. And they're both really fantastic services with really great teams building all sorts of cool stuff. So both are very much worth checking out for anyone who finds this stuff interesting. Both of them, though, are services, and sometimes you want an open source project for any number of reasons, and this is where GraphQL Mesh comes in. GraphQL Mesh is from the Guild, and Yuri Goldstein is really big into this and has done lots and lots of talks about it, because it is, like we've been talking about, a way to take lots and lots of different endpoints and smash them all together into one big GraphQL endpoint. GraphQL Mesh, though, is on a whole nother level in terms of like the stuff you can do with it. You can use SOAP, you can use gRPC, you can do all sorts of stuff. And things like TakeShape and StepsIn are certainly capable of that. And I think you're going to continue to add more of these. It's partly just a question of who are the users, what do they want to do, and how much demand is there for these different languages at any given time. And so you can look at all of them and kind of see what they offer. But then the flip side is you would have to host your own mesh if you were using GraphQL Mesh. This is something that a friend of mine has actually done and has hosted it on PM2 and this like absolutely insane jerry-rigged kind of setup, and it works, but it's not fun. And that's why you then would want to check out something like StepsIn or TakeShape, or something that is interesting and I know really nothing about, but for the sake of completion is worth mentioning. Graphical Portal is a hosted service that is building on GraphQL Mesh. So they're trying to take the open source project of GraphQL Mesh and then build kind of a service on top of it. So you get a little more visibility into like what the actual underlying tech of your mesh is, which can be a little hard to do when you're using a service that has like proprietary technology. You can't really get into the code base. And so that's something that's kind of always a challenge for me. And I would probably end up checking this out in a little bit, just kind of see what it actually is like. I've talked to the founders a little bit and they seem like a cool bunch. So that is all of the projects. And now going back to the original FSJam, the point of the podcast is to talk about the frameworks, the libraries, and the services. It is all of these things together that kind of make up this larger bundle of things we call FSJam. And among these things I've shown you, you can combine them in literally hundreds of different unique combinations of technology to build all sorts of things. almost all of these, if they're not already open source and free, have a generous free tier. A handful of them are a couple dollars a month if you do want to use them, but those are ones that are very, very featureful. So I think that this is a really great way for beginners to get in, because it's aimed at trying to simplify these workflows, and it's also aimed at doing that in a really cheap way and not getting you into a position where you accidentally deployed a Kubernetes cluster that costs $70, or something like that. And that is really big for me as someone who came from this whole bootcamp world and who was also like very, very broke when I was going to bootcamp. And it's such a crazy group of like sophisticated technology that is being offered at such low prices. And this goes back to the pioneers of a lot of this stuff, which is things like Netlify and Vercel, and of course Heroku, who gave you the ability to spin up these kind of hobby dev free projects that are limiting but powerful for what they're giving you for free. And once you start mixing and matching these, you'd be amazed the type of things you can start building with them. So that is pretty much my whole talk. If anyone has any questions, feel free to let me know. Happy to answer any of them.
Cool, that was great. Anyone has any questions for Anthony? That was so cool to see so many things. There's a few things that I haven't heard before, like Fly.io or like the guild thing. I didn't know that there was an open source thing, that mesh that Jaden's gonna be talking more about, but open source. I didn't know that existed.
Yeah, the guild is awesome, because Yuri Yolchin was one of the original founders of Apollo. So, and before that, he was on Meteor. So he's been on this GraphQL journey almost longer than anyone, except like probably Lee Byron and those guys. Wow. And he left Apollo, and then now is this, they call themselves like a group of decentralized developers that work together in a bunch of interlocking tools. So most people who do GraphQL know about things like GraphQL Code Gen, and there's GraphQL tools and lots of these kind of like libraries that are really common in the GraphQL system, but there's like kind of an underlying group of people that are basically like are actually maintaining all of these things. And there are a bunch of repos under their individual names, not under one group guild GitHub. So it can be kind of hard to see it as a group, but they all share the same values of like maintaining your open source and continue like responding to issues and helping people actually work with the tech. You'll see a lot of these people in the GraphQL Discord answering questions, helping people out. So it's very community focused. It's very cool. So I'm really big fan of the guild.
That's cool. Do you know if they have support from a company or something?
So they build their own tools for client projects. And so that's kind of what sustains them. So the tools are a byproduct of the work that they're doing. They're being paid to do. They're not necessarily being paid to create the tools, but being paid to solve problems. They solve the problems by building these tools that are then open source.
That's cool. That's very cool.
Cool. And thanks so much for having me.
Cool. Thanks, Anthony.